Colonel Mitchell watched the quiet woman pour his coffee with barely concealed disdain, making snide comments about her place in the military hierarchy. But when her phone rang with "Pentagon urgent" and she answered with "General Rodriguez speaking," the entire cafeteria fell silent as they realized the server outranked everyone in the room. The Fort Bragg cafeteria buzzed with the familiar sounds of military life, the clatter of metal trays, the hum of conversation between soldiers grabbing quick meals between training exercises, and the steady rhythm of boots on polished floors. Steam rose from industrial coffee urns, while the aroma of fresh brewed coffee mixed with the scent of regulation breakfast fare. Fluorescent lights cast their harsh glow over rows of tables where officers and enlisted personnel sat in their designated areas, the invisible lines of military hierarchy as clear as painted boundaries on the floor. Maria Rodriguez moved through the cafeteria with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to blend into any environment. At 48, she possessed the kind of understated presence that allowed her to observe without being observed, to listen without being noticed. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard civilian volunteer uniform, a plain polo shirt and khakis, that marked her as cafeteria staff rather than military personnel. What none of the soldiers and officers she served knew was that Maria Rodriguez was one of the most powerful women in the United States military. As a 3-star general, she commanded strategic operations and advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff on matters of national security. Her decisions affected thousands of service members across multiple theaters of operation, and her expertise in military strategy was sought by the highest levels of government. But for 2 weeks each year, Maria took leave from her high-ranking position to volunteer at military base cafeterias across the country. Using her maiden name and civilian clothes, she worked as an ordinary food service volunteer, pouring coffee, serving meals, and cleaning tables. This unusual practice wasn't about humility or penance. It was about staying connected to the reality of military life at the ground level, listening to unguarded conversations, and understanding the real impact of the decisions she made from her Pentagon office. The challenge Maria faced wasn't the physical demands of cafeteria work or the anonymity of her disguise. It was witnessing firsthand the attitudes and behaviors of military leaders when they thought no one of importance was watching. During her volunteer stints, she had observed everything from inspiring leadership to troubling examples of abuse of power. She had learned that some officers treated subordinates with respect and dignity, while others revealed their true character only when they believed they were among peers and away from the scrutiny of higher command. Maria's assignment to Fort Bragg represented her most challenging volunteer experience yet. The base was known for its elite units and high-pressure training environment, but it was also rumored to have issues with toxic leadership that had been difficult to document through official channels. Her decision to volunteer here wasn't random. Reports had reached her office about morale problems and concerning behavior among certain officers. But the complaints had been vague and difficult to substantiate. As she began her 2-week assignment, Maria quickly identified the source of many problems: Colonel James Mitchell, the deputy base commander responsible for training operations. Mitchell was everything that was wrong with military leadership, a man who had learned to be obsequious with superiors while showing contempt for anyone he considered beneath his station. He was smooth and professional in official settings, but his true character emerged in informal environments where he believed he could speak freely. During her first week, Maria observed Mitchell's interactions with enlisted personnel, civilian staff, and junior officers. She watched him dismiss valid concerns with condescending smiles, saw him make inappropriate comments about female service members, and witnessed his casual cruelty toward anyone who couldn't challenge his authority. The pattern was clear and disturbing, but Maria needed concrete evidence before she could take action. Maria's strategy was simple but effective: maintain her cover while documenting Mitchell's behavior through careful observation and, when possible, discreet recording. She positioned herself to work the morning shift, when Mitchell typically held his informal meetings with other officers, often using the cafeteria as an extension of his office for discussions. He preferred to keep away from official channels. Her approach required extraordinary discipline. When Mitchell made disparaging comments about diversity initiatives or questioned the competence of female officers, Maria had to remain silent and continue serving coffee. When he dismissed the concerns of enlisted personnel as unworthy of consideration, she had to bite her tongue and clear tables. Every instinct she had developed as a senior leader screamed at her to intervene. But she knew that revealing her identity prematurely would end her ability to gather the evidence needed to address the systemic problems Mitchell represented. The plan was working perfectly until Mitchell's behavior escalated beyond anything Maria had anticipated. What had started as an intelligence-gathering mission was about to become a direct confrontation that would test every aspect of her leadership skills and self-control. The challenge was no longer just documenting inappropriate behavior. It was deciding when and how to reveal the truth about who she really was. The first major incident occurred during Maria's second week at Fort Bragg. She was refilling coffee urns when Mitchell arrived for his usual morning meeting with several other officers. The conversation started normally enough: discussions about training schedules, personnel assignments, and logistical concerns. But as the officers became more comfortable, Mitchell's true opinions began to emerge. "The problem with all these diversity initiatives," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who believed his opinions were both correct and important, "is that they're lowering our standards to accommodate people who simply aren't qualified for leadership positions. We're promoting women and minorities not because they're the best candidates, but because it looks good for the politicians." Maria's hands tightened on the coffee pot, but she continued her work, moving closer to the table while maintaining the invisible presence that good service staff cultivated. The other officers at the table shifted uncomfortably, but none challenged Mitchell's statement directly. "Take General Hayes," Mitchell continued, referring to Maria's direct supervisor and mentor. "Everyone knows his promotion was politically motivated. The man couldn't strategize his way out of a paper bag, but he checks all the right boxes for the current administration." The casual dismissal of a decorated combat veteran and brilliant strategist was so offensive that Maria had to concentrate on her breathing to maintain her composure. Mitchell's comments became increasingly inappropriate as the week progressed. During one particularly offensive morning session, he gestured dismissively toward Maria as she served coffee to his table. "Look at this," he said to his companions, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is exactly the kind of position these people are actually qualified for. Serving coffee, cleaning tables, doing the support work that keeps the real military functioning." The real military comment hit Maria like a physical blow. She had spent over 2 decades serving her country, had commanded troops in combat operations, and had earned her rank through merit and dedication. But Mitchell saw only a middle-aged woman in civilian clothes, someone he could dismiss and demean without consequence. "I bet she's never even seen a weapon, let alone used one," Mitchell continued, clearly enjoying his audience's uncomfortable laughter. "But somehow, we're supposed to believe that people like her could lead soldiers in combat. The whole system has gone soft, and it's going to get good soldiers killed." Yeah, Maria's military training kicked in, allowing her to maintain her composure while her mind raced through the implications of what she was hearing. This wasn't just casual prejudice, it was systematic bias that could affect promotion decisions, training assignments, and ultimately the safety and effectiveness of military operations. Mitchell's attitudes were exactly the kind of toxic leadership that undermined unit cohesion and military readiness. Word of Mitchell's behavior began to spread through informal channels, though not in the way Maria had expected. Rather than other officers reporting his inappropriate comments, she began to notice that junior personnel were finding excuses to avoid the cafeteria during his morning meetings. Enlisted soldiers who had previously used the space for informal gatherings started taking their breaks elsewhere, and civilian staff members requested schedule changes to avoid serving Mitchell's table. The pattern was subtle, but unmistakable. People were voting with their feet, choosing to avoid an environment that had become hostile and unwelcoming. Maria realized that Mitchell's behavior was having a broader impact than she had initially understood. It wasn't just about inappropriate comments. It was about creating an atmosphere where certain people felt unwelcome and unsafe. During her conversations with other cafeteria staff, Maria learned that Mitchell's behavior extended beyond his morning meetings. He had a reputation for making inappropriate comments to female service members, dismissing the concerns of enlisted personnel, and generally treating anyone he considered beneath his station with contempt and disrespect. The situation was clearly worse than the reports that had reached her Pentagon office had indicated. Mitchell wasn't just a problem officer, he was a systemic issue that was affecting morale, retention, and the overall effectiveness of the base's operations. The breakthrough moment came when Mitchell's phone rang during one of his morning meetings. The caller was apparently a superior officer, because Mitchell's entire demeanor changed instantly. His voice became respectful, almost obsequious, as he assured the caller that everything was under control and that he was handling all personnel issues with appropriate sensitivity and professionalism. The transformation was so complete and so obviously calculated that even the other officers at the table exchanged glances. Maria watched in fascination as Mitchell demonstrated exactly the kind of two-faced leadership that was most dangerous in military organizations, the ability to present one face to superiors while showing a completely different character to subordinates. When the call ended, Mitchell immediately reverted to his previous behavior, making a joke about having to play politics with the brass and dismissing the concerns he had just promised to address. The casual way he lied to his superior and then bragged about it to his peers was a clear indication that this was a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. Maria realized that she had witnessed something that would be impossible to document through official channels. Mitchell was too skilled at managing his image with superiors to be caught through normal oversight mechanisms. Her undercover assignment was providing insights that would never be available through conventional leadership assessments. As Maria's second week at Fort Bragg drew to a close, she began preparing for the most challenging aspect of her mission, deciding how and when to reveal her true identity. The evidence she had gathered was substantial and damning, but she needed to be strategic about how she used it. A premature revelation could undermine her credibility and allow Mitchell to claim that she had been conducting some kind of entrapment operation. The decision was made for her when Mitchell's behavior escalated to a level that demanded immediate intervention. During what was supposed to be her final morning at the base, Mitchell arrived at the cafeteria in a particularly foul mood. He had apparently received criticism from his superiors about recent training results, and he was taking out his frustration on everyone around him. His comments that morning were the most offensive Maria had heard, including explicit statements about the incompetence of female officers and minorities in leadership positions. But what pushed the situation beyond the point of no return was when Mitchell began making specific threats about how he would handle personnel under his command who didn't meet his standards. Maria realized that she could no longer remain silent. The situation had moved beyond documentation and observation. It now required direct action to prevent potential harm to service members under Mitchell's command. The crisis moment arrived without warning on Maria's final morning at Fort Bragg. She was cleaning tables near Mitchell's usual spot when her secure phone began ringing with the distinctive tone that indicated a Pentagon emergency. The caller ID showed Pentagon, urgent, and Maria knew from experience that such calls were never routine. They indicated situations that required immediate attention at the highest levels of military command. Mitchell looked up from his conversation with obvious irritation, his face flushing with anger at the interruption. "Hey, coffee, lady," he called out, with the kind of casual disrespect that had become his trademark. "Turn that damn thing off. We're trying to have a serious conversation here, and your personal calls aren't more important than military business." Maria paused, looking at the phone display. The call was coming from the Joint Operations Center, which meant it was likely related to an active military situation that required her immediate attention. But Mitchell was glaring at her with the expectation that she would immediately comply with his order. "I said turn it off," Mitchell repeated, his voice rising with authority. "I don't care who's calling you. It can wait until you're done with your job here. Some of us have real military responsibilities to discuss." The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Mitchell was ordering a 3-star general to ignore a Pentagon emergency call because he believed she was just a cafeteria worker whose personal life was interfering with his informal meeting. The casual arrogance of his assumption that he had the authority to control her actions was a perfect example of the toxic leadership she had been documenting. Maria looked at Mitchell, then at the other officers at the table who were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. She could see in their faces that they recognized Mitchell's behavior was inappropriate, but none of them had the courage to challenge him directly. This was exactly the kind of situation that allowed toxic leadership to flourish, good officers remaining silent, while bad officers abused their authority. The phone continued to ring, and Maria knew that every second of delay could have serious consequences for whatever situation was developing. She had spent her entire career putting duty before personal comfort, and she wasn't about to let Mitchell's arrogance interfere with her responsibilities to the nation and the military personnel who might be in danger. "I'm sorry, Colonel," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that hadn't been there during her 2 weeks of serving coffee. "But I need to take this call." Mitchell's face turned red with anger. "You need to remember your place," he snarled, standing up from his chair to emphasize his physical presence. "I'm giving you a direct order to turn off that phone and get back to work. I don't know what kind of operation they're running here, but civilian staff don't ignore orders from military officers." The other officers at the table looked increasingly uncomfortable, but still none of them intervened. Maria realized that this moment was going to define not just her mission at Fort Bragg, but potentially the careers of everyone present. How she handled Mitchell's challenge would determine whether the toxic leadership she had been documenting would continue unchecked. She looked directly at Mitchell, her posture straightening into the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Colonel Mitchell," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank and experience. "I'm going to answer this call now." Without waiting for Mitchell's response, Maria answered the phone with the words that would change everything. "General Rodriguez speaking." The silence that followed was so complete that the normal sounds of the cafeteria, the hum of refrigeration units, the distant clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations at other tables seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Mitchell's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror, as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The voice on the other end of the phone was crisp and urgent. "General, we have a developing situation in the Mediterranean. Intelligence indicates a potential terrorist attack on one of our naval vessels. We need your immediate assessment and recommendations for response options." Maria's entire demeanor transformed as she shifted into the role that had defined her career. Her voice became sharp and decisive as she began asking the detailed questions that would allow her to understand the situation and provide the strategic guidance that was needed. She requested specific intelligence reports, asked about the positioning of nearby assets, and began formulating response options based on the information she was receiving. The coffee lady had disappeared, replaced by one of the most senior military strategists in the United States Armed Forces. As Maria continued her phone conversation with Pentagon leadership, the full scope of the crisis became clear. A terrorist cell had been identified planning an attack on a U-S Navy destroyer conducting routine operations in the Mediterranean Sea. The intelligence was solid, but the timeline was compressed. The attack was planned for within the next 6 hours, and immediate action was required to prevent potential casualties. Maria's mind shifted into the strategic thinking mode that had made her one of the most respected military leaders in the country. She began coordinating with multiple command centers, requesting real-time intelligence updates, and evaluating response options that ranged from diplomatic intervention to direct military action. Her questions were precise and her analysis was sharp, demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that had earned her 3 stars and the respect of her peers. Throughout the conversation, Mitchell and the other officers at the table sat in stunned silence, watching as the woman they had dismissed as a cafeteria worker took command of a complex international crisis. The transformation was so complete and so professional that it was impossible to doubt the authenticity of her authority. Maria's voice carried the confidence of someone who had managed similar crises before, and her questions revealed an intimate knowledge of military capabilities, international law, and strategic implications that could only come from years of experience at the highest levels of command. As the crisis call continued, Maria found herself balancing multiple complex considerations. The immediate tactical situation required careful coordination with naval commanders in the Mediterranean, but the broader strategic implications involved diplomatic considerations that could affect international relationships for years to come. She was simultaneously managing real-time intelligence analysis, coordinating with Allied forces, and considering the political ramifications of various response options. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She was conducting one of the most important strategic consultations of her career while standing in a military cafeteria, surrounded by officers who had just witnessed their colleagues' spectacular failure of judgment and leadership. Mitchell's face had gone from red with anger to pale with shock, and his hands were visibly shaking as he began to understand the career-ending nature of his mistake. The other officers at the table were equally stunned, but their expressions showed a mixture of fascination and professional respect as they watched a master strategist at work. They were witnessing the kind of high-level military decision-making that most officers never had the opportunity to observe directly. The Pentagon call intensified as new intelligence indicated that the terrorist threat was more imminent than initially believed. Maria's responses became more rapid and decisive as she coordinated with multiple command centers across different time zones. She was simultaneously managing communications with naval commanders in the Mediterranean, intelligence analysts at various agencies, and diplomatic personnel who were working to address the political aspects of the crisis. Her strategic recommendations were clear and well-reasoned: reposition the targeted destroyer to safer waters, increase security protocols for all naval vessels in the region, and coordinate with Allied forces to intercept the terrorist cell before they could execute their attack. Each decision was made with the kind of confidence that came from years of experience managing similar crises, and her analysis of the situation was both comprehensive and actionable. The officers watching her work began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A senior military leader managing a real-time international crisis with the kind of skill and expertise that defined the highest levels of military command. The complexity of the situation increased as additional intelligence revealed that the terrorist cell had connections to multiple international organizations, and that the planned attack was part of a larger coordinated effort. Maria had to quickly adapt her strategic recommendations to account for these new variables, coordinating with counterterrorism experts and international intelligence agencies to develop a comprehensive response plan. Her ability to process complex information quickly and make sound strategic decisions under pressure was evident to everyone in the cafeteria. She was managing multiple communication channels simultaneously, asking detailed questions that revealed her deep understanding of military capabilities and limitations, and providing guidance that demonstrated her mastery of both tactical and strategic considerations. The officers at Mitchell's table watched in amazement as she coordinated with senior officials across multiple government agencies. Her authority and expertise evident in every interaction. The contrast between their initial dismissal of her as a cafeteria worker and the reality of her actual position and capabilities was stark and undeniable. The critical moment of the crisis came when Maria had to make a recommendation about whether to authorize a preemptive strike against the terrorist cell. The decision required balancing the immediate threat to American personnel against the potential diplomatic consequences of military action in international waters. It was exactly the kind of complex strategic decision that defined her role as a senior military leader. Her analysis was thorough and decisive. She recommended a coordinated response that would neutralize the immediate threat while minimizing diplomatic fallout, a combination of targeted military action and diplomatic intervention that would address both the tactical and strategic aspects of the crisis. Her recommendation was accepted by Pentagon leadership, and she continued to coordinate the implementation of the response plan. Throughout this critical phase of the crisis, Maria demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and leadership that had earned her position as one of the most senior military officers in the country. Her ability to manage complex, high-stakes situations with confidence and expertise was evident to everyone present, and the contrast with Mitchell's earlier behavior was impossible to ignore. The officers watching her work began to understand that they were witnessing not just effective crisis management, but a masterclass in strategic leadership that would inform their own development as military leaders. The crisis reached its successful conclusion when Maria received confirmation that the terrorist cell had been intercepted and neutralized without incident. The coordinated response she had recommended had worked perfectly. The immediate threat had been eliminated. American personnel were safe, and the diplomatic complications had been minimized through careful coordination with allied forces and international agencies. As she concluded the call and put away her phone, Maria looked around the cafeteria at the faces of the officers who had witnessed her performance. The transformation from dismissed cafeteria worker to respected strategic leader was complete, and the impact on everyone present was obvious. Mitchell sat in stunned silence, his face pale with the realization of what he had just witnessed and the magnitude of his earlier behavior. The other officers looked at Maria with a mixture of respect and amazement, understanding that they had just observed one of the most senior military leaders in the country successfully managing an international crisis. The quiet woman who had been serving coffee just minutes earlier had revealed herself to be exactly the kind of leader that Mitchell had claimed didn't exist, a highly competent, strategically minded officer whose expertise and authority were beyond question. The immediate aftermath of Maria's revelation was electric, with tension and disbelief. Mitchell sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, horror, and dawning realization of the career-ending nature of his behavior. The other officers at the table looked between Maria and Mitchell with the kind of fascination that comes from witnessing a dramatic reversal of fortune. Maria's transformation from invisible cafeteria worker to commanding general was so complete that it seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. Her posture, her voice, her entire presence radiated the authority and confidence that had been hidden beneath her volunteer disguise. The contrast was so stark that it was impossible to believe this was the same person who had been quietly serving coffee just moments before. Word of the incident spread through the base with a speed that only military gossip could achieve. Within hours, everyone at Fort Bragg knew that Colonel Mitchell had spent 2 weeks insulting and dismissing a 3-star general, and that he had been caught in the most spectacular failure of judgment in the base's recent history. The story became the kind of cautionary tale that would be told and retold for years to come. The long-term consequences of the incident were swift and decisive. A comprehensive investigation was launched into Mitchell's leadership practices, and the evidence that Maria had gathered during her 2 weeks undercover provided a detailed picture of systematic toxic leadership that had been affecting morale and effectiveness throughout the base. Mitchell's career was effectively over. He was reassigned to a logistics position with no command authority, and within 6 months he had opted for early retirement rather than face the continued scrutiny and professional isolation that his behavior had earned. The officers who had witnessed his conduct but failed to challenge it also faced consequences, though less severe ones that focused on leadership development and professional education. More importantly, Maria's experience at Fort Bragg became a case study that was incorporated into leadership training programs throughout the military. The incident highlighted the dangers of prejudice and assumptions, and emphasized the importance of treating all personnel with respect regardless of their apparent rank or position. It became a powerful example of how toxic leadership could be identified and addressed when senior leaders were willing to step outside their normal roles to understand the reality of military life at all levels. 6 months later, Maria was promoted to 4-star general in a ceremony that was attended by the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. In her acceptance speech, she referenced the Fort Bragg incident as a reminder of the importance of humility and the need for leaders to stay connected to the people they serve. True leadership, she said, is not about the rank on your collar or the position on your business card. It's about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. It's about understanding that every person in uniform, regardless of their role or rank, deserves respect and dignity. And it's about remembering that the moment you stop learning from the people you lead is the moment you stop being an effective leader. The quiet woman who had served coffee to a colonel had become one of the most senior military leaders in the country, and her story served as a permanent reminder that assumptions about people's capabilities and worth could be not just wrong, but dangerously so.